Well, thank you all, and nobody's asking any simple questions in this group, that's for sure. And I'm not sure how many great answers we'll get, but maybe I can help from my impressions to describe how we might want to start thinking about this and what the bigger chunks of it might be. By the way, David and I met some 18 years ago out in the region. He has long service on the peninsula. I've got many frequent visits for exercises and have some impression on how we do business now. Well, the question that was assigned to this panel was ROK-US multi-domain warfare in Korea. What will effective deterrence and desirable command demand? And the question barely consumes 2 lines, but it hides several implicit assumptions and competing national interest. And we need to understand at least a few of them if we're going to make a stab at answering it. Let's stipulate that effective deterrence depends on creating an undoubted ability to prevail. And the audience for that convincing ability to prevail is our allies and the other guy. Prevail, in turn, means, in the U.S. view, the ability to protect the territory, the interest, and the lives of our allies and friends. And deterrence, as all the deterrence scholars have pointed out repeatedly, is of 2 types. One is the threat of punishment if an event happens, and the other is denial. And denial, in the case of North Korea, might mean, as a working definition, that North Korea is unable to assume that they will be successful in striking the ROK, Japan, China, Russia, or the US with a nuclear weapon. In Korea, in the question, implies, as is done in far too many discussions on this topic, that a renewed conflict between the Koreas would be contained, as the last one was, to the peninsula. That assumption ignores geography, today's technology, and national interest. It misses the fact that there are 2 other nuclear-armed states with profoundly differing interests that share a border with North Korea. It ignores the fact that Japanese cities are lucrative targets, and with the history between Korea and Japan, they can become very tempting targets in a conflict for Korea. That North Korea has nearly as many submarines now as Germany had at the beginning of World War II, and you'll recall from history that we had a bit of a time with that. They have a massive conventional arsenal of hardened and concealed artillery and rocket weapons in the Kaesong Heights just above Seoul. Some 14,300 of these sites by open press estimates. And there's over 26 million people at risk in the greater Seoul metropolitan area from a conventional barrage that can be launched from the Kaesong Heights. Most important, entrepreneurial proliferator for power and profit, North Korea has proven that they really like this, and they have succeeded. We had 3 administrations starting from the early 90s in the Clinton administration, then the George H.W. Bush administration, then the Obama administration, and now the Trump administration, 4 administrations, saying that we're going to stop this and not allow North Korea to get nuclear weapons. North Korea most assuredly has nuclear weapons. And they've done this in serial violation of sanctions that we, the United States, repeatedly declared were effective. From the Clinton administration on, when we first discovered North Korea's nuclear efforts after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we established a pattern that North Korea commits a provocation at the beginning of one of our administrations. We immediately threaten a preemptive attack. After some consideration, we decide against preemptive attack because our allies would pay a disproportionate cost. Then we go to negotiations, then we go to agreements. North Korea cheats on the agreements, then we go to sanctions. And every time we swear, this time the sanctions will be effective. And we have not made them effective because sanctions are not applied against an inanimate object. It's not like painting a wall. Sanctions are applied against living, breathing, venile, ambitious people who will always find ways around it for profit and for patriotism and just for sheer evil intent. We have been unsuccessful in making these things effective. Therefore, with all these functions going on around the peninsula and our other allies involved, the war on the peninsula is far too important to be left solely to the two nations on the peninsula. For one thing, the reach of their weapons is such that it's going to be impossible for it to remain on the peninsula. But there are alternative considerations. ROK policy and strategy are changing profoundly with President Moon. In the previous administration, the Park administration, we had track 2 discussions where the South Koreans would, with some frequency, raise the issue of nuclear weapons for South Korea. Our response was usually strong resistance with a fallback position that if the only way that these would make sense is that if South Korea, the government of South Korea, needed nuclear weapons on the peninsula to convince their own people that the U.S. alliance was still solid and that our guarantees of extended deterrence were still solid. These nuclear weapons must always remain under U.S. control. For one, they need to be connected to the U.S. nuclear arsenal because the first action will engender a reaction, and South Korea doesn't have the capability, nor should it get it. Number 2, the relations between the rest of our friends out there in South Korea would change profoundly if the ROK had nuclear weapons, and proliferation would follow within a month, particularly in Japan, who has a vast store of weapons-grade nuclear material. Well, but elections have consequences. In comes the Moon Jae-in regime. President Moon is engaged in a series of initiatives that call our current sanctions and the UN sanctions into question, effectively neutering them. He's rapidly changing the ROK defense posture, reducing obstacles in a demilitarized zone and pulling troops away from their positions on a demilitarized zone. Exercises have been canceled, and this is more important than it sounds because U.S. and ROK, especially at the start of any conflict on the peninsula, are vastly outnumbered by the North Koreans. We rely on really exquisite synchronization of all our capabilities across air, land, sea, space, cyberspace, and electronic warfare. It's no longer armies directly fighting armies. It's all the forces on one side always attacking the enemy from positions where the enemy can't respond to you. And this requires a familiarity with the weapons systems. It requires a familiarity with the whole command and control system. And it requires the confidence to be able to integrate here. Without practicing, without these drills, and it's not just the big exercises, it's many smaller ones that occur throughout the year to maintain proficiency, then we risk going into the Super Bowl with a team that hasn't played together before. And that forfeits our one big advantage and a big part of our deterrence. Our chairman of our Joint Chiefs has recently talked about this. He said, quote, "The more successful we are on a diplomatic track, the more uncomfortable we will be in the military space. Over time, this negotiation will take a form where we're going to have to start making some changes to the military posture on the peninsula, and we're prepared to do that in support of Secretary Pompeo." And the military follows a diplomatic lead, and that's what Chairman Dunford is saying. But you start reducing the U.S. military presence on the peninsula, you fundamentally change things around. I'll leave it to David to talk about the specific force structures that we have on the peninsula, but the image that people have of 28,500 Americans standing there on the DMZ at fixed bayonets ready to repel the North Koreans is not what we're about. That's the South Korean mission. We're there primarily in the support, the command and control, and the supporting arms and the logistics mode, which is just as necessary, if not more so. So it's a fundamental change when we start pulling that plug out of the peninsula. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Kim family business lost the benefactor that had supported it from birth. Conventional wisdom in those days held that North Korea's collapse would inevitably follow quickly, and it would become part of our celebration of the end of the Cold War. If North Korea had been a conventional nation state, that might have been true. But it was more a global criminal enterprise that cared nothing about its people. Kim enjoys the leverage that nuclear weapons conferred. Therefore, the most valuable deterrent capability would be being able to deny Kim any assurance that he can successfully strike another nation. With some modification to current capabilities, we can do this with capabilities that we possess now, 3 of them in particular. Pervasive surveillance conducted from altitudes well above commercial aircraft and well out of any other military aircraft in the Sea of Japan, looking down into North Korea, that can detect missiles upon launch. Cooperative engagement capability where target quality data can immediately pass from these surveillance platforms to firing platforms, either at sea, in the air, or in space, and then launch on remote from this. And with a missile that is fast enough, you can achieve boost phase intercept from a position above the Sea of Japan. We don't have that missile now, but we're the United States. We certainly ought to be able to produce this. Boost phase intercept destroys North Korean missiles, nuclear or otherwise, over North Korea, which is a wonderful thing, and it takes Kim's investment over the years and his father's investment and his grandfather's investment in nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles and basically moves their value towards zero, getting very close to zero. If he can't, for example, if he can't be confident that he can wake up one day and order a strike on Japan and the strike will be successful, and if he's worried that he will have to eat the damage from this strike, then I submit we've done a lot to eliminate his main capability, and we've also done quite a bit to enhance our deterrence. Thanks.
Thanks, sir. Okay. Well, thank you, and it's great to be able to follow the general. First, let me disagree with Henry in his opening remarks and give my caveat here first. He used the word Korean experts, and I'd have to say that there really are no Korean experts. Everybody knows North Korea is what we call a hard target, and it's hard for a lot of reasons. It's hard to understand, and I think I'd consider myself a student of North Korea, seeking understanding and trying to understand the problem up there, and of course the nature of the Kim family regime, which the late Stephen Bradner characterized as a mafia-like crime family cult. And I think General Gregson already described some of that in his remarks there. So a mafia-like crime family cult. Let me just start off with 2 things to frame things from a deterrence perspective and a denuclearization perspective. In 1997, Hwang Jong-yap, at the time the highest-ranking defector, the father of Juche ideology, he defected. And of course, one of the questions that Americans asked him after the Koreans had spent time debriefing him, was North Korea's invested all of this money in their military. And we know that they want to reunify the peninsula and use force to do it. Why haven't you attacked the South? And Hwang Jong-yap was kind of surprised, I guess, from talking to the debriefer there. And he said, well, there's only one reason. He said, the United States. We can't win a war with the United States. We can't win a nuclear war with the United States. And if there's war in the Korean Peninsula, the United States will use nuclear weapons. And he said that is why they have not initiated hostilities. And I tell that story for a couple of reasons. One, maybe deterrence works. Maybe our declaratory policy had effect, and that has deterred, up to that time, Kim Jong-il from attacking. And it also, of course, explains why the North has been hell-bent on developing a nuclear program, developing nuclear weapons, really since the 1950s. They send about 250 scientists to Moscow in the 1950s to get PhDs in technical disciplines. And, the Soviet Union gave them a test, experimental reactor in the 1960s. They have been pursuing nuclear weapons for all this time. And of course, one of the reasons, I think, is the result of the Korean War. I don't think we can really appreciate what our Air Force, naval, marine aviation did to North Korea during the Korean War. But if you follow North Korean propaganda, they remember and they teach that to all of their citizens, and that we devastated the countryside. We see how South Korea, rose from the ashes. How devastated Seoul was, but the North was far, far worse. So I think deterrence works until it doesn't. That's Sir Lawrence Friedman said that. I didn't make that up, but I think that's a pretty good saying. Now, denuclearization is another word that is. When CVID was established, the original was complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of the nuclear program. The first time denuclearization was used was in the 1992 agreement between North and South Korea on denuclearizing the peninsula. And of course, we all know that we unilaterally removed nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, in 1991. And so there are no nuclear weapons in South Korea. But North Korea has persisted and got language into the Pyongyang or the Panmunjom Declaration and the Singapore Summit about denuclearizing the entire Korean peninsula. And President Moon and President Trump, I think somewhat unfortunately, adopted that narrative. And it's important to understand what North Korea, how they define denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. To them, denuclearization must entail removal of U.S. troops. It must end the ROK-US alliance, end the nuclear umbrella over South Korea and Japan. That is the ultimate security guarantee that the North needs. Before then, it will negotiate dismantlement of its nuclear weapons. And so denuclearization is an important, and denuclearization of the entire Korean peninsula is important to understand because, of course, we just look at denuclearization of the entire peninsula of North Korea getting rid of its nuclear weapons. But that's not the case. The other thing, we have shifted from CVID to FFVD. FFVD. I don't know what the FF is, but I sure don't want any VD. But I don't know who comes up with these acronyms. But it's final, fully verifiable dismantlement or denuclearization. And people have criticized Secretary Pompeo for removing irreversible. And talking to experts, there are experts in many areas, so I do talk to them. But one of the things that someone, I think, rightly pointed out is North Korea's nuclear program will never be irreversible because they have the knowledge, they have the scientists, they have the technicians. Even if they give up their nuclear weapons, they could theoretically restart it in the future. So I think that's probably one reason why irreversible is off the table. Now, when Henry set this up, he talked about policy and intelligence. And so I have two policy questions and two intelligence questions that I always ask. And the first question that we all should think about in Korea, what do we want to achieve in Korea? What does the United States want to achieve? I'd submit it's not just dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear program. And so to follow on to that question, more specifically, is what is the acceptable, durable political arrangement that will protect, serve, and advance U.S. and ROK-US alliance interests on the Korean Peninsula and in Northeast Asia? we should really be thinking about that from a policy perspective. And then, of course, developing the strategy to achieve those policy goals. But from an intelligence point of view, the two key questions are, do we believe that Kim Jong-un has abandoned the 7 decades old strategy of subversion, coercion, extortion, and use of force to achieve unification dominated by the North in order to ensure survival of the Kim family regime? I mean, that is a foundational question that we must answer. And there are only 3 answers to that. Number 1 is yes, he has. Okay, if we believe that, then we can engage and everything will be fine. We can say no, and then we need to take the appropriate measures to deal with that. And of course, the real answer is, I don't know. I don't know. And I don't think any of us can know. And so, as a prudent military planner, my assumption has to be, no, they won't give up their nuclear weapons, and we need to proceed from there. Now, that said, I think there's still value in engaging, negotiating, testing sincerity, and the like. But I'll talk about that. The second intelligence question, related to the one I just discussed, is in support of that strategy, do we believe Kim Jong-un has abandoned the objective to split the ROK-US alliance and get U.S. forces off the Korean Peninsula? Divide and conquer. Divide the alliance to conquer the ROK. And I think that, and obviously those two questions are related. Now, the fundamental question that our U.S. Special Representative, Stephen Biegun, is seeking to answer in negotiations, and it's unfortunate that he has really not gotten to work. He has not met his counterpart, Chae Sung-hee. They have not conducted any negotiations at the working level. But what he is going to try to answer is, has Kim Jong-un made the strategic choice to end his nuclear program and seek a brighter future for Korea, which is, of course, all of Korea. And that's really the strategic choice. We've heard talk about economic development and that can be problematic. We have heard and we know that his constitution says that they're a nuclear power. There are many reasons to believe that he is not willing to give up his nuclear program. And so we should think on those questions there. So understanding North Korea's strategy, I think it's important that we try to understand the strategy through what we can assess might be his lens. Obviously the vital interest is survival of the Kim family regime, and that's not survival of the nation state, not survival of the Korean people living in the North, survival of the Kim family regime. Strategic aim is unification to guarantee regime survival in the lines of effort: subversion, coercion, extortion, and use of force. The key condition, splitting the ROK-US alliance. And fourth is the desire for the regime to be recognized as a world power, and really specifically as a nuclear power. That has been long desire. And in fact, they would love to negotiate from a position of strategic arms limitation talks or strategic arms reduction talks, because that would put them on a par with the former Soviet Union in negotiations with the U.S. And that would really further legitimize Kim Jong-un and the regime. Now, South Korea, we've heard the concerns of, Henry started with in the opening remarks, and General Gregson laid out, the differences now we have with President Moon in power. And Korean politics has shifted. It's much more progressive, and it is, I think we're going to see, continued changes. And they, I think President Moon operates from an assumption that he can trust Kim Jong-un. And that has real problems, and problems for us in that. And we have seen and heard the criticism that the ROK has gotten out too far out in front of the alliance. I think there's some truth to that. The Pyongyang Declaration, September 19th, was a very interesting follow-up to the Panmunjom Declaration, and in that was the what they're now calling the Comprehensive Military Agreement. It was a long name about implementing the Panmunjom Declaration, the historic Panmunjom Declaration, in the military domain. And basically, I call this new agreement the alternate armistice agreement on steroids, and asymmetric agreement on steroids. 4 A's there. And it's on steroids because it does much more than the armistice in terms of processes and procedures. But it's asymmetric because the agreement is really one-sided. We look at that as a trust-building agreement, and really all the measures really affect readiness in the South. The no-fly zone limits our ISR capabilities. The inability to train on the DMZ, to conduct live fire training, impacts our ability to conduct the counter-fire fight, to defend against the artillery. The General pointed out in the caisson heights that can range Seoul and range the front line areas. With the South Korean forces that can't conduct live fire training along the DMZ, and we can't conduct air-to-ground training at Pilsung Range, the only air-to-ground bombing range in South Korea that we can use because it's inside that buffer zone. So there are a number of faults with the agreement. I've called out my Korean counterparts on this, and it was explained to me by the embassy, by the Minju Party, that the purpose of this agreement is not just trust building, but to prevent incidents on the DMZ that would hinder the negotiation process. And so, the South has moved out in terms of removing guard posts, removing fencing from the South Barrier fence line, removing anti-tank obstacles. 13 anti-tank obstacles this year will be removed on the major invasion routes. All of that weakens readiness, weakens our defensive capabilities. But it is done, I think, under the guise of a confidence building measure. But of course, there's been no reciprocity from the North, none whatsoever. My recommendation had been, if you're going to negotiate this, that you should, call for North Korea to reposition its artillery. 20 to 40 kilometers behind the DMZ would be a nice start. Representatives from the Minju Party, Cho Mi-ae, she said that's too much to ask the North Koreans, and so they didn't ask. The South Koreans negotiate the special measures agreement and burden sharing harder with us than they do with North Koreans. And I heard one of our former negotiators say that the South Koreans only negotiate with themselves when they're talking to North Korea. They talk themselves out of doing things. And now I am told by members of the embassy and by military counterparts that they want to continue to negotiate this comprehensive military agreement, that it's not over. And that's good to hear, and that they assure me that they want to get concessions such as removing the artillery and pushing that back. If they would do that, that would really take away their ability to conduct a no-notice or little-notice attack, because they would have to reposition the artillery, and we would obviously observe that and have early warning. Now, U.S. force structure. Let me just touch on that for a little bit. We have consolidated most of our forces at Camp Humphreys, Osan Air Base, Kunsan Air Base, logistics down in Daegu, Wagwon there, naval headquarters down in Hialeah, Pusan area. But really, the bulk of U.S. forces are consolidated at Camp Humphreys, and our air forces at Osan and Kunsan. And the general is right. We look at our forces, we should look at our forces in three: the station forces, the rotational forces, and the follow-on forces, or the TIPFID, the time phase force deployment data for follow-on forces should there be a contingency or war. And we don't have U.S. forces stationed on the DMZ. Handful of people at the Joint Security Area who now don't even carry sidearms in accordance with the agreement, which is problematic. We have unarmed soldiers in the Joint Security Area, but we don't have forces on the DMZ. That is South Korea. We haven't had a U.S. sector of the DMZ since the early 1990s, which is really a shame because it's a good mission for U.S. soldiers. But what we really need to do is determine what are the right forces. And again, the general outlined intelligence, logistics, the capability to bring in follow-on forces, RSOI, receive, station, receive, station, onward movement, and integration of forces. And so we need to ensure we have the right forces on the peninsula. Now, Henry wanted to talk about kill chain and South Korea's desire for ballistic missiles. I think that has been a desire by the military for some time. And this really fits into a bigger problem of integrated missile defense. You know, our ideal would be to have an integrated missile defense capability with South Korea and Japan. You know, we know that that's difficult, because of Japanese-Korean relations. But we would like to have, layered defense and capabilities to be able to defend against the missile threat from the north. The South has long pushed, and it took a long time for them to buy Patriot PAC-3, to give them, when back in the 1990s they bought, used Patriot PAC-2s from Germany, which, are only good for air breathers and not for missiles. Finally, they're investing in Patriot PAC-3. Some Aegis capability, I think. I'll leave it to you naval experts on that. And of course, we deployed THAAD, one of the most controversial decisions both in South Korea and in China. But what we have tried to do is to develop an integrated missile defense capability, because none of those capabilities defend against, obviously, all types of missiles and in all ranges and heights of flight. Now, we would like the ROK to be able to do that as well, but they have long wanted to make their contribution offensive. And this is the kill chain. And of course, they want offensive missiles that will be able to preempt or attack missiles at the point of origin, which sounds good in theory, but making the decision to do that before they fire, that's problematic. I mean, I think that's difficult for us to do. I think it'd be difficult for anybody to do. However, I think with the Moon administration, I don't think they're going to aggressively pursue this. I think the military will want to, but I don't think that the Moon administration is going to develop military capabilities. In fact, the demographic problem of South Korea, the declining military age male, they are already going to have to reorganize their military into smaller organizations, smaller units. They're reducing the time of conscription. And so I think you're going to see, probably a premature peace dividend, that the South Korean government is going to want to try to extract from all the goodwill that's being developed. So I don't think you're going to see a heavy emphasis on the kill chain. Now, lastly, and I'll just so much more I could talk about here. I usually like to talk about the big five, the big threats when you look at it. Obviously war. Second is regime collapse. Third is human rights, crimes against humanity. You wouldn't think that human rights is something we talk about, but it is a national security issue. Both from the fact that North Korea has to deny human rights to be able to stay in power, but they also exploit their population to mine uranium, to conduct slave labor around the world to gain funding. And from an information point of view, whenever we call out North Korea for its nuclear program, it legitimizes Kim Jong-un. But when we call out their human rights, it not only gives hope to the people in the north, if you talk to escapees, it undermines the legitimacy of the regime. And we know that by his response. And if you heard the reports this last week from Human Rights Watch of the terrible atrocities being committed against women in the north as a matter of routine, North Korea has responded to that, of course, denying all and making counter accusations. But that has an effect on the psyche of Kim Jong-un and the Kim family regime. And of course, the fourth threat are asymmetric threats, provocations to gain political and economic concessions. It's nuclear program, missile program, it's special operations, it's cyber. When we talk about multi-domain, we really need to focus on North Korea's cyber capability. I mean, just yesterday was a report that another attack of South Korean security software by North Korean malware has occurred. Port of San Diego, the Onslow County water treatment plant in North Carolina, malware from North Korea. And they're conducting cyber reconnaissance. They're preparing for the future. They haven't done any major attacks of the United States, although $81 billion stealing from Bangladesh, which impacts the Federal Reserve. The Sony hack was pretty, pretty comprehensive there. But they haven't done really any major attacks against U.S. government or major economic targets. But it's coming, and that domain is something we need to be concerned about, as well as its illicit activities around the world. And so when we talk about the threats, we really have to address the entire range of threats. War being the worst, but its asymmetric capabilities are really keeping the regime in power, keeping it, the ability to fund the regime. It comes back down to, where I started with this, is what is in Kim Jong-un's mind? What is his strategy? Has he given up his strategy? Is he going to continue to pursue his strategy? And really, are we being played? And of course, if he doesn't give up his nuclear weapons, what does that mean? And what does that mean for the security situation? And I think in the second or the third panel, we'll talk about the alliance and reinventing for the future. But I would say that there's no successful outcome on the Korean Peninsula that doesn't involve the strength of the ROK-US alliance and being prepared for the worst case. That really has to undermine, or not undermine, it's to underlay and be the foundation for all our diplomatic activities. And without that, the South is at risk, and of course our interests. So I'll stop there and leave the rest to you.